Nobody looked at the old janitor until the young captain said the words that made the whole room go still. "Sir, please step away from the radio. This is not a place for a mop." The Rescue Operations Center at Falcon Ridge Air Base was already under pressure, but that sentence changed the air. It was not shouted. It was not cruel in the dramatic way people imagine cruelty. It was worse than that. It was casual. Automatic. The kind of disrespect that comes from deciding another man is too old, too ordinary, and too invisible to matter. Thomas Walker stood beside a cleaning cart under the fluorescent lights, one hand resting on the handle, the other near the pocket of his faded gray work shirt. His white hair was neatly combed. His maintenance badge hung from a worn blue lanyard. His boots were polished, although nobody in the room had ever noticed. His eyes stayed calm. Around him, the base was fighting a communications failure. A rescue training mission 40 miles north of Falcon Ridge had gone wrong in the mountains. A helicopter crew had entered bad weather during a planned search and rescue exercise. They were not declared lost. They were not in open danger yet. But their radio contact had become broken, unstable, and almost useless. Every few minutes a fragment of a voice came through the speakers, then dissolved into static. The situation would have been serious on any morning. This morning, it was being monitored by 4-star General Robert Hayes. Captain Ethan Brooks stood at the center of the operations floor with a headset pressed to one ear. He was 31, sharp-faced, clean-cut, and determined to look in control. His uniform was immaculate. His jaw was tight. The screens around him showed green indicators, perfect diagnostics, and signal paths that should have worked. They did not. "Run Channel 7 again," Brooks ordered. A technician adjusted the frequency. Static answered. "Route through Western Relay." Another attempt. More static. "Run a full hardware diagnostic." The room moved quickly. Fingers tapped keyboards. Headsets crackled. The large map at the front showed steep ridges, shifting weather, and a helicopter marker blinking near a valley north of the base. Thomas continued emptying trash bins as if he were not standing inside the most important room on base. Most people ignored him. They had ignored him for years. To the younger airmen, he was just Mr. Walker, the old civilian janitor who arrived before sunrise, cleaned without complaint, and left after everyone else had stopped noticing the floors. But Airman Caleb Turner noticed. Caleb was 23, new enough to still look at people instead of around them. He had seen Thomas unlock the operations center before dawn. He had seen older veterans on base nod to him with unusual warmth. Not formal respect. Something quieter. Something earned. That morning, Caleb noticed something else. Whenever static came through the overhead speaker, Thomas did not flinch. He listened. Not like a curious bystander. Not like an old man bothered by noise. He listened like the static was a language. Another transmission cracked through. "Falcon, this is Ridge, losing," the words broke apart. Brooks slammed his hand lightly on the console. Not enough to damage anything. Enough for the whole room to hear his frustration. Signals do not vanish for no reason. Thomas looked up at the terrain map. "They are not vanishing," he said quietly. "They are bending." Several heads turned. Brooks looked over his shoulder. "Excuse me." Thomas nodded toward the mountain display. "Weather is pushing them under the ridge. The signal is bouncing west before it reaches you." A technician gave a short laugh. Another looked down at his screen to hide a smile. Brooks forced a thin professional expression. "Mr. Walker, we have trained communication specialists working this problem." "I know," Thomas said. "Then let them work." Thomas did not argue. He did not defend himself. He returned to wiping the edge of an empty desk. His face showed no embarrassment, but Caleb saw his hand pause for 1 second near his shirt pocket. Something small hung beneath the fabric there. A flat metal shape on an old chain. The room kept working. Nothing improved. 10 minutes later, a new weather update rolled across the main screen. The interference zone had widened. The helicopter crew tried to transmit again. A voice came through, faint and broken, then disappeared behind a hard wall of static. Thomas stopped moving. He was not staring at the screen anymore. He was staring at the speaker. Caleb saw the change in his eyes. Recognition. Captain Brooks paced behind the primary console. Try the emergency band. The operator obeyed. Static. Lower encryption handshake. Reroute through Tower 3. Static. Again. Static. The room grew smaller with every failure. Coffee cup sat untouched. Chairs creaked. Nobody wanted to speak too loudly, because every failed attempt sounded more official than the last. Thomas moved closer to the secondary radio station, still pushing his cart. He did not touch anything. He only listened. When the next burst came through, he said, "You are transmitting at the wrong time." Brooks closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, the patience was gone. "Mr. Walker, this is not a maintenance issue." "No," Thomas said. "It is a mountain issue." A few people laughed softly. Brooks turned fully toward him. "With all due respect, you are guessing." Thomas looked at the large map again. "No," that single word landed strangely. Not loud. Not proud. Just certain. Brooks folded his arms. "You are standing in a restricted operations center with a cleaning cart. My team is managing a live mission. Step back." Caleb felt his face grow warm. The captain had not cursed. He had not screamed. But the message was clear. "Old man. Mop. Stay in your place." Thomas lowered his eyes, nodded once, and moved back beside his cart. Only then did Caleb notice the object again. When Thomas bent to replace a trash liner, a small metal tag slipped partly from his pocket. It was not a dog tag exactly, though it had the same plain, military look. It was a narrow brass callsign plate, worn smooth at the edges. Caleb caught 2 words before Thomas tucked it away. Raven Echo. Caleb had no idea what it meant. Another attempt failed. The helicopter marker blinked on the screen. The crew was still moving, still responding in fragments, but the instability was getting worse. Wind over the ridgeline had shifted. The mission. Clock kept climbing. Brooks leaned over the console. Falcon Ridge to Rescue 3, acknowledge. Static. Falcon Ridge to Rescue 3, acknowledge. A broken voice answered. 3, copy, unable, Ridge, the rest was swallowed. Thomas closed his eyes. Caleb stepped away from his station and walked toward him. "Mr. Walker," he said softly. Thomas opened his eyes. "Yes, Airman. You heard something." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "So did everyone else." "No," Caleb said. "You heard something different." The old man studied the young airman. His face was calm, but tired. Not the tiredness of age alone. The tiredness of carrying a memory too long in silence. "They are trying to push through when the weather is closing the valley," Thomas said. "They need to wait for the drop, not the lift." Caleb looked at the map. "How do you know?" Thomas glanced toward the overhead speaker. "Because I have heard that mountain before." Before Caleb could answer, Captain Brooks shouted for another attempt. The room leaned toward the radios. Static rose, broke, and dipped. For less than 3 seconds, the helicopter voice came through clearer than before. "Old Raven route, repeat." "Raven," Thomas went completely still. The color left his face, not in fear, but in memory. His fingers tightened around the handle of the cart. His thumb rubbed the hidden brass plate in his pocket. Caleb lowered his voice. Raven Echo. Thomas turned to him slowly. The young airman swallowed. I saw the tag. Thomas did not look angry. He looked like a man who had been found by something he had tried not to disturb. That was a long time ago, he said. Across the room, Brooks removed his headset in frustration. We are losing them again. Caleb looked at the unused microphone sitting beside the secondary radio. It was older than the other equipment, heavy black plastic with a worn push-to-talk button. Most of the team treated it as a backup piece, almost a relic. Caleb picked it up. Thomas immediately shook his head. Airmen. They are listening for Raven, Caleb said. They are listening for procedure. No, Caleb said. They are listening for calm. The words made Thomas look away. For the first time all morning, the old janitor did not seem like part of the room. He seemed like someone standing on the edge of a memory that still had a voice. Caleb held out the microphone. Thomas did not take it. Brooks was still focused on the main console. The technicians were moving through another checklist. Nobody was watching the corner of the room. Mr. Walker, Caleb said, I do not know who you were. But I know what I just saw. You know this problem. Thomas looked at the microphone. Then at the map. Then at the ceiling speaker, where static hissed like rain on old metal. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the brass plate. Raven Echo. The letters were scratched. The chain was darkened with age. On the back, barely visible, were 3 engraved words. Stay calm. Listen. Caleb stared at it. Thomas wrapped his fingers around the plate once, then let it fall back against his shirt. All right, he said quietly. One call. Caleb placed the microphone in his hand. Thomas lifted it with the careful familiarity of a man touching an instrument he had not played in years. His posture changed. Not dramatically. His shoulders simply squared. His chin lifted a fraction. His eyes sharpened. He waited. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. Thomas did not rush. He did not talk over the static. He listened to the pattern, the rise and fall of interference, the rhythm of weather moving across stone. Then he pressed the button. His voice entered the room low and steady. Rescue 3, this is Raven Echo. Do not climb into the noise. Hold your line. Wait for my count. The room froze. Every head turned. Captain Brooks spun around. Who keyed that microphone? Thomas did not look at him. He listened. Static rolled. Then a voice answered. Weak. Broken. Alive. Copy. Raven Echo, holding line. Nobody moved. The response had come so fast that the room needed a second to understand it. Then every console erupted at once. Signal received. Audio confirmation. Rescue 3 is responding. Telemetry stabilizing. Brooks stared at Thomas as if the old man had just stepped through a wall. Thomas kept the microphone close. Rescue 3, keep your nose steady. You will get a clean pocket in 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Transmit now. The crew came through clearer. Falcon Ridge, Rescue 3. We have partial navigation and stable altitude. Visibility low. Awaiting instructions. A wave of relief moved through the operations center, but Thomas did not smile. He gave them only what they needed. Rescue 3, you are not alone. Follow the valley floor. Do not chase the signal. Let it come to you. Caleb felt the hair rise on his arms. The words were simple, but they carried something that no diagnostic could produce. Calm. Authority. Experience without ego. Brooks stepped toward him. Mr. Walker, remove yourself from that station. Thomas finally looked at him. Captain, he said, still holding the microphone, your crew is listening. Brooks stopped. It was not defiance. It was not disrespect. It was a fact. For the next 8 minutes, the entire operations center listened to the old janitor guide the rhythm of communication. He did not issue flight commands. He did not pretend to be the pilot. He gave timing. He found clear pockets in the interference. He heard changes in the static before the screens displayed them. Every time the weather folded the signal, he waited. Every time the valley opened, he spoke. Transmit now. Hold. Again. Good copy. Slowly, the mission stabilized. The helicopter crew regained reliable contact. The operators confirmed their location. The training emergency shifted from crisis to controlled recovery. And Thomas Walker placed the microphone back on the desk as if returning a borrowed tool. The room stared at him. He picked up a trash bag. Captain Brooks walked over, his face stiff. How did you know that call sign? Thomas tied the bag carefully. It used to be mine. A silence spread across the floor. Brooks glanced at the brass plate hanging against Thomas's shirt. You served. Thomas looked down at the plate, then tucked it away again. A while ago. That was all he said. The young captain looked embarrassed for half a second, then hid it behind procedure. I need to verify your authorization to access communications equipment. Caleb stepped forward. Sir, with respect, he just helped restore contact. Brooks turned on him. Airman Turner, this is still a secure facility. Thomas raised one hand gently, stopping Caleb before the young man could say more. It is all right, Thomas said. He began pushing his cart toward the rear wall. Before he could leave, a supervisor at the main console frowned at an incoming priority message. His posture changed immediately. Captain, he said. Brooks walked over. What is it? The supervisor read the message twice before speaking. Airborne command. General Hayes has received the audio from the transmission. The room became quiet again. Brooks looked at the screen. The message was short. Hold Thomas Walker at Operations Center. General Hayes diverting to Falcon Ridge. Do not dismiss him. Brooks read the final line again. Do not dismiss him. No one in the room said anything. No one needed to. Thomas stood beside his cart, looking at the floor. Caleb looked from the screen to the old man. You know General Hayes? Thomas gave a faint, almost sad smile. I knew Robert before he was General Hayes. High above the state line, inside a military transport aircraft, General Robert Hayes sat with a headset in his hands. The cabin around him was quiet except for the engines. A communications officer had replayed the audio twice. The first time, Hayes had gone still. The second time, he had closed his eyes. Raven echo. Stay calm. I am here. The voice was older now. Rougher. Slower. But time had not changed the thing that mattered. It was the same voice that had carried through rain, darkness, and fear when Hayes was a young lieutenant who did not yet know whether he was worthy of command. He remembered a night decades earlier when storms had scattered a field exercise across hostile terrain. He remembered being young, exhausted, and responsible for men who were looking to him for certainty he did not feel. He remembered a radio channel full of confusion. Then came the voice. Not loud. Not dramatic. Stay calm. I am here. Thomas Walker had been a communications specialist then. Older than Hayes by almost 10 years. Quiet. Practical. The kind of man who fixed problems before officers knew how to describe them. He never sought attention. Never chased decorations. Never told stories about himself. He simply made sure other people made it home, made the right call, or found the courage to speak when fear locked their throats. Hayes remembered asking him once why he never sounded afraid. Thomas had answered, because somebody on the other end needs calm more than they need my fear. That sentence had followed Hayes through his entire career. Now, decades later, that voice had returned through a recording from Falcon Ridge. The general removed the headset. "How long to Falcon Ridge?" he asked. His aide checked the flight plan. "If we divert now, 32 minutes. Divert." The aide hesitated only because the order was unexpected. "Yes, sir." Hayes looked out the small window at the gray clouds. "Also send a message ahead. Nobody is to release Thomas Walker." The communications officer nodded. "Do you want a personnel file pulled?" Hayes looked back at the headset. "I want his record pulled. I want the old communications roster pulled. And I want someone to find out why a man like that is cleaning floors while his name is missing from the wall." At Falcon Ridge, the operations center had changed completely. The mission was stable, but nobody had returned to normal. People glanced at Thomas and then looked away when he noticed. The old assumptions were cracking, and no one knew what stood behind them. Captain Brooks stood near the priority message, his mouth set in a hard line. He was not a bad officer. That was the uncomfortable truth. He was competent, ambitious, and careful with rules. He believed in systems because systems had rewarded him. What he lacked was not intelligence. It was imagination. He had looked at Thomas Walker and seen age before experience. A uniform badge before a life. A cleaning cart before a history. Caleb stood beside Thomas near the rear wall. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Caleb asked. Thomas watched the operators working. "Most people do not ask janitors for war stories. You could have told them anyway." Thomas shook his head. "A man should not have to announce his worth every morning." Caleb had no answer for that. The brass plate rested against Thomas's shirt. Caleb looked at it again. "Raven Echo," he said. "Was that your call sign?" Thomas nodded. "What does it mean?" "It means somebody was listening when nobody could see you." Outside, the sound of an approaching aircraft rolled over the base. The room seemed to feel it before anyone spoke. Vehicles moved on the flight line. Security personnel took positions. Senior officers hurried through corridors. Word passed quickly. General Hayes had landed. Captain Brooks straightened his uniform and stood near the entrance. The operators rose from their chairs as footsteps approached. The door opened. General Robert Hayes entered with aides and senior officers behind him. He carried the authority of rank without needing to display it. His hair was silver. His face was controlled. His eyes moved across the room once, then stopped. Thomas Walker stood beside a cleaning cart. For several seconds, neither man moved. The room waited. Hayes walked past Captain Brooks without stopping. Past the supervisors. Past the glowing screens. Past every person who expected to be addressed first. He stopped in front of Thomas. The old janitor looked up. Hayes's face softened. "Thomas." Thomas nodded once. "Robert." A quiet shock moved through the room. No one called a four-star general by his first name. No one except a man who had known him before the stars. Hayes looked at the brass plate on Thomas's shirt. "You kept it." Thomas touched the plate lightly. Could not throw away a voice. Hayes swallowed. For a moment, all the rank in the room seemed to fall away, leaving only two older men standing in front of a memory. "I heard you on the radio," Hayes said. Thomas lowered his eyes. "Only did what was needed." "You always say that." The general turned slowly toward the room. His voice remained calm, but it carried to every corner. Most of you know me because of the rank on my shoulders. Thomas Walker knew me when I had no idea how heavy a single decision could feel. No one moved. Hayes continued. There are people in this room who trust equipment. You should. There are people here who trust procedure. You should. But never make the mistake of thinking technology replaces experience, or that a quiet man has nothing left to give. Captain Brooks looked down. Hayes faced Thomas again. Years ago, when I was a young lieutenant, I heard this man guide exhausted crews, frightened officers, and lost voices through the worst hours of their lives. He never asked for credit. He never raised his voice. He never made himself the center of the story. The general paused. But many of us are still here because he was on the other end of the radio. The silence deepened. A records officer stepped into the room holding a folder. He handed it to one of the aides, who passed it to Hayes. The general opened it and read for several seconds. His expression changed. Why is his commendation incomplete? Hayes asked. No one answered. The aide checked another page. Sir, it appears the final recommendation was filed during a command transition. It was never entered into the public base record. Hayes looked up. Thomas's face remained calm, but Caleb saw his fingers tighten around the cart handle. The general understood immediately. Not because Thomas explained. Because men like Thomas rarely did. How long? Hayes asked. The aide swallowed. 41 years. A low murmur moved through the room. 41 years. 41 years of a name missing from a wall. 41 years of younger men walking past him without knowing. 41 years of cleaning the floors beneath rooms where his voice should have been remembered. Hayes closed the folder. Then he said the line that would travel across Falcon Ridge before sunset. Some voices do not retire. The room went completely still. Hayes turned to Captain Brooks. Captain, what did you say to him before he took the radio? Brooks looked as if he had been struck without anyone touching him. He glanced at Thomas, then at the general. I told him to step away, sir. Hayes waited. Brooks's voice lowered. I said this was not a place for a mop. The words sounded smaller now than when he had spoken them. Thomas looked away, not with anger, but with mercy. Hayes said nothing for several seconds. That was worse than any reprimand. Then the general looked at Brooks and spoke evenly. Captain, procedure protects missions. Humility protects people. You will need both if you intend to lead. Brooks nodded. Yes, sir. Hayes turned back to Thomas. In front of the entire operations center, the four-star general came to attention. The movement was crisp. Old school. Absolute. He raised his hand in salute. Not to a janitor. Not to an employee. Not to a memory. To Thomas Walker. The room seemed to hold its breath. Thomas stood frozen. His eyes lowered to the floor for 1 second. When he looked up, his face had changed. The calm was still there, but something beneath it had broken open. Not grief. Not pride. Recognition. His hand rose slowly. He returned the salute. One by one, others in the room stood straighter. Some had never served in combat. Some had never known Thomas as anything but the man with the cleaning cart. But every person understood what was happening. Honor was being returned in public because it had been lost in silence. Captain Brooks stepped forward. Mr. Walker, he said, voice tight, I owe you an apology. Thomas lowered his salute and looked at him. Brooks continued. I judged you by what I saw, not by what you knew. I was wrong. Thomas studied him for a moment. Then he said, learn from it, Captain. That will be enough. Brooks nodded, and this time the nod was not procedural. It was human. General Hayes handed the folder to his aide. Correct the record today. I want Thomas Walker's name entered into the Falcon Ridge Communications Legacy Wall. I want the missing commendation reviewed and restored through the proper channels. And I want that call sign plate displayed with his approval, not taken from him. Thomas shook his head softly. Robert, I do not need all that. Hayes smiled faintly. I know. That is why you should have it. A small sound came from the overhead speaker. The helicopter crew had returned to stable contact and was approaching the base perimeter. The pilot's voice came through clear this time. Falcon Ridge, Rescue 3. Request permission to speak to Raven Echo. Every eye turned to Thomas. Hayes nodded toward the microphone. Thomas stepped forward slowly. Caleb moved aside and gave him room. The old microphone waited on the console. Thomas picked it up. Raven Echo here. The pilot's voice answered, steady but emotional. Sir, whoever you are, thank you. We heard you when nothing else made sense. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. Then he pressed the button again. You did the hard part. I only helped you hear the way home. The room was silent. After Rescue 3 landed safely, the operations center did not erupt into cheers. It did something more powerful. It stood. Not all at once. Slowly. Chairs moved back. Technicians rose. Operators removed headsets. Senior officers stepped away from screens. Caleb stood first near the rear wall. Then another airman. Then a supervisor. Then Captain Brooks. Finally, the entire room stood for Thomas Walker. He looked uncomfortable with it, of course. Quiet heroes usually are. They can carry loss for 40 years, but applause feels too heavy. General Hayes placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Let them, he said. Thomas looked across the room. At the young faces. At the older officers. At the radios that had carried his voice one more time. His fingers touched the brass plate. For years, that plate had been a private relic. A reminder of a time when his voice mattered to people he could not see. Now it was no longer hidden beneath a work shirt. It was seen. Later that evening, Falcon Ridge held a small ceremony in the same operations center. Not polished. Not planned. No band. No cameras arranged for public relations. Just the people who had been there and the people who understood what had almost been missed. A temporary placard was placed on the communications legacy wall. Thomas Walker, Raven Echo Communications Specialist, stay calm. Listen. Below it hung a printed copy of the corrected record, signed for review by General Hayes. Thomas stood before it without speaking. Caleb stood beside him. Does it feel strange? Caleb asked. Thomas looked at the wall for a long time. It feels late, he said. Caleb lowered his eyes. Thomas then added, but late is still better than never. Captain Brooks approached quietly. He was no longer carrying the sharp certainty from that morning. Mr. Walker, he said, would you consider speaking to the junior communications team next week? Not officially. Just, if you are willing. Thomas glanced at him. Brooks did not defend himself. Did not make excuses. He simply waited. Thomas looked at the young operators behind him, then at Caleb. 1 hour, Thomas said. Brooks nodded with real gratitude. Thank you. Thomas touched the brass plate once more. And Captain? Yes, sir. Thomas smiled faintly at the word sir. Teach them the equipment. But also teach them to listen. Brooks nodded. I will. General Hayes watched from a few steps away. His expression was quiet, almost proud. Not proud of himself. Proud that the room had learned what rank sometimes forgets and age often proves. Before leaving, Hayes stood beside Thomas one last time. "I spent 40 years remembering that voice," the general said. Thomas looked at him. "I spent 40 years hoping it had done some good." Hayes's eyes softened. "More than you know." They shook hands, but it became something more than a handshake. Hayes held on for an extra second, as if thanking a younger man who was still standing somewhere in the past. The next morning, Thomas Walker arrived before sunrise as usual. The hallway floors still needed cleaning. Trash bins still needed emptying. Coffee still spilled near the consoles because young airmen still forgot lids when the mission clock started moving. But the operations center was different. When Thomas entered, conversations paused. Not awkwardly. Respectfully. Caleb Turner stood from his station. "Morning, Mr. Walker." Then, after a brief hesitation, he added, "Morning, Raven Echo." Thomas shook his head. "Do not start that." But there was a smile in his voice. Captain Brooks looked up from the command table. He did not overdo it. He did not make a show. He simply nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Thomas nodded back. "Captain." On the wall behind them, the temporary placard waited for the permanent one. It caught the early light from the windows. "Stay calm. Listen." The phrase was not loud. It did not need to be. Some lessons are not shouted across a room. Some are carried through static. Some are hidden for decades in the pocket of an old work shirt. And sometimes, if a room is lucky, a quiet man is finally heard before it is too late. Thomas pushed his cleaning cart across the operations floor. This time, everyone noticed.